Thomas, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Kin. It's a pleasure.
So Europe vassalized to America. I think a lot of people have, there's been this isn't spoken about, I think, as readily and as boldly as you are right now, but I think there have been sentiments shared where people feel like, Europe is just going along with America, much to Europe's detriment. And now you're pointing this out that they have just been recklessly attaching themselves to the Biden administration. So tell us about this freak out that you think they're having there in Europe now that Trump is going to come in as president of the United States again this January.
Yeah, I really do think that this is that Trump's election is the EU establishment's worst nightmare, as I write in the article, because yes, for the past 4 years, but in fact, even going further back, most of the EU leaders have been just completely subordinating themselves to the Biden's reckless strategy, foreign policy strategy, to the complete detriment of their own interests. And they've been framing every aspect of the EU's foreign policy in American terms, basically. That has included, NATO expansion, decoupling from Russia, and even following the U.S. lead on China and then on Israel and Gaza. And they're suffering, I would say, a big pushback in terms, because a lot of these policies are not popular, especially when it comes to Ukraine. There's a strong popular opposition to the EU's involvement in the proxy war in Ukraine, first and foremost because of the devastating effects that this has had on ordinary people in Europe in economic terms. But even beyond that, it's clearly been a completely suicidal strategy for Europe, not just in economic terms, but in geopolitical terms as well. Europe has become the world's laughingstock. We're just seen as poodles of America, following America wherever it goes, even if this goes completely against our own interests. And that is, incredibly obvious to everyone. And it's I would say it's obvious to most of the global majority, but also to increasingly a lot of European citizens that the benefits of the transatlantic relationship, of our alliance of friendship with America, are wearing very thin. In fact, some would say have disappeared completely. Europeans have been told for a very long time that Europe and America are natural allies, that the transatlantic alliance is the foundation of European prosperity, and that we share a common destiny, and that our interests are naturally convergent. Now, this has never been entirely true. I mean, America won a war in the Second World War as major power, and since then has viewed Europe as essentially a province of the American empire, to be subject to American control. So this is not, we have to go back if we want to understand how we got to this point. We have to understand the structural conditions that were in place that allowed this hyper-vassalization that we're witnessing now to take place. And it is an 80-year long history, really. And it dates back to, World War II, after which America, started treating Europe, as I said, as a province of its own empire to be subject to its control. And it has been exercising this control through a variety of means. These are, economic means all the way, from the Marshall Plan onwards, through military means, of course. Let's not forget that 80 years after the end of World War II, the US still holds a massive military presence in Europe, especially in the two countries that lost the war, Germany and Italy. Of course, it's then been exercising its military control over Europe through NATO, which again, we are told is an alliance among equals, but everyone knows that's not the case. Everyone knows that NATO is subject to essentially U.S. de facto control, and then we have the various ways in which the various entanglements between the U.S. security state and the various European security states, and that has played a very important role throughout all post-war history, and that has included America being involved in especially in the 70s and 80s, in a number of, for example, false flag terrorist attacks, which were then blamed on socialist and communist left-wing movements in order to marginalize them. So, for example, if we fast forward to Nord Stream, the worst terrorist attack on a European infrastructure ever, which we know the US was involved in some way or another, if not directly, indirectly. Again, this is not something new. America has been involved in these kinds of terrorist acts, Europe, for a very long time, enjoying it, I'd say. So this was the first phase, I would say, of US control of Europe, the Cold War period. And that was a time when you could justify it in some ways. At least that was a time when Europe benefited economically, at least in material terms, at least from a sort of capitalist development perspective, from being a part of the US dominated hegemonic bloc. Even though that was based, of course, on exploitative relations with the global south and all that. But you can clearly make the case that, there were material benefits to being part of the US empire, even if in a very subordinate position. And yet at the time, Europe was able to also assert a relative autonomy. That was because we had very smart politicians, and these politicians were anchored in mass parties, which had a very strong mass base, so the US couldn't overplay its hand. So this was the first phase, I would say, of American control over Europe. And then we have the end of the Cold War. And that completely shifts the dynamics, because at this point, we see, interests that were relatively convergent up until that point started to diverge. Because after the Cold War, clearly Europe had an interest in normalizing relations with Russia, in fact, bringing Russia into the kind of Euro-Atlantic sphere. That's in fact what post-Cold War, what post-Soviet Russia wanted. And this would have been clearly in Europe's interest. It would have been in Europe's interest from an economic standpoint and from a security standpoint. It would have been Europe's interest to do away with NATO and to build a new security architecture with Russia, respectful of Russia's security concerns and, of course, Europe's security concerns. Obviously, America had other plans, as we know, with Russia, with the Soviet Union no longer in the way. America decided to go for full-on, global dominance, the Wolfowitz doctrine, and all that. And it's important to understand that this wasn't just directed at Russia and, for example, China, even though China back then wasn't much of a big deal. It was also directed against Europe. So this Wolfowitz doctrine of full spectrum dominance, of preventing the rise of any alternative power to America, also included Europe. This was very clear, and that's why it's always been a geostrategic imperative for America to sort of drive a wedge between Europe and Russia, to prevent the rise of a Eurasian geopolitical reality that would essentially render the American security umbrella, so-called security umbrella, meaningless, and that would have really consolidated a new Eurasian hegemonic bloc that would have severely threatened America's plans for hegemonic global dominance. And I think this explains a lot, for example, I think, of the rationale behind NATO expansion. I think it wasn't just directed at Russia, it was also directed at Europe to start to sort of, drive a wedge between Europe and Russia. And yet, at that time, we still saw Europe being able to relatively assert its interests and its autonomy, especially Germany. So, of course, we know that throughout most of the 2000s, Germany really asserted itself as the unquestioned political and economic hegemon in Europe. Again, that was something that didn't completely jibe with America's plans because they started seeing Germany as a political competitor when it came to sort of political control of Europe. But also we see Germany establishing growing ties with Russia. And that's also, a big red flag for America. So Nord Stream is the most obvious example. And and then, of course, we have the third critical turning point, which is the Russia-Ukraine war, which completely reverses this trend. We see America using that war to reestablish its complete economic, political, technological, and military control over Europe. Essentially, as you mentioned, completely re-vassalizing, in fact, hyper-vassalizing Europe to a degree that it's never been before. It's been what's happened over the past 3 years is really quite astonishing. I think no European would have imagined that we could have got to this point. I mean, as an Italian, up until not too long ago, I mean, for me, I remember looking up at Germany and even fearing Germany as this, scary hegemon, which was imposing its policies, throughout Europe, and even, under Merkel's lead, standing up in ways to America. I mean, we remember that the big economic tensions that Germany had with the US during Obama, and then of course during Trump, and so I think in this sense, the Ukraine war has to be understood from the US perspective, not just as a war against Russia, but also, and perhaps first and foremost, as a war against Europe. But then again, it doesn't make sense to separate Europe and Russia because ultimately this war is about, once and for all, driving, as big a wedge as possible between Europe, and especially Germany, and Russia. And so I think in the current context, continuing to remain beholden to the transatlantic alliance from the perspective of Europe's sort of natural geostrategic interests makes no sense whatsoever. Our interests today, to the extent that they were fully convergent, are today fully divergent, and this is evident just from looking at the impact of the Ukraine war. This is a war that America has, at least in the short term, hugely benefited from, economically, militarily, and Europe has only lost out economically, geopolitically, and so we have a complete divergence. And yet, at this time, at a time when the cost, the benefits of the transatlantic alliance have all but evaporated, we see, as we've been saying, Europe being more vassalized than ever. So this is kind of what you could call the paradox of vassalization. And now, and of course, now we have the Trump factor, which again kind of throws the cards up in the air because Europe's elites are so wedded to the transatlantic alliance, so-called alliance, that they really can't. They don't know how to deal with a more isolationist America.
Right.
And so, I think this is the big problem from their perspective. I mean, they're materially, psychologically wedded to this, essentially to their subordination to America. They want to be told what to do. And the problem is that they've invested so much in one strategy that if now the strategy changes, that completely undermines the rationale for all the policies that they've implemented over the past 3 years. So you can see why they're freaking out. They've acted against Europe's basic interests in the name of unquestionably following America's lead. And now, if America's direction changes, then what do the vassals do? So I think the vassals are freaking out because of this change of leadership at the top. And now I think partly they're awaiting orders, so to speak, but partly they're afraid that that's kind of a Trump disengagement or relative disengagement from Europe will leave them exposed to the consequences of the policies of the past few years, exposed to the fact that they have no real strategy for Europe aside from just going along with whatever America tells them to do. And of course, they're left with the disastrous consequences of this proxy war, which they also don't know how to deal with.
Right.
Autonomy. So I think this explains a lot of what's of the panic I think that's swirling around Europe at the moment. But this is in itself a consequence of vassalization. If you're used to just taking orders, then when there's a change of guard at the top, then of course you start freaking out because
right. One of the consequences of vassal states is oftentimes the financial consequence of it, right? Being taxed by the larger. And you say something like this in your piece. You say, people, let me just read this one paragraph. You say Trump has suggested that he might unilaterally impose a ceasefire and peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. This is unlikely to happen, which I agree that it's unlikely to happen. Even Putin says this is unlikely to happen. Russia, which is winning on the battlefield, will push for such a hard bargain that even Trump may struggle to accept. A more likely outcome, then, is that the incoming Republican administration will continue to deliver weapons to Kiev, but ask Europe to foot the bill, a situation that would allow the conflict to smolder on even as Europe gets poorer. That's despite the fact that even Western media outlets are now conceding the war in Ukraine is lost. I think this is a very likely outcome. I also think that same with NATO, in Trump's first term, there was a lot of chatter about getting rid of NATO, and a lot of people like myself would like to see that happen. I mean, I just don't see the point of that sort of security alliance anymore. But that's not what happened, right? I mean, NATO certainly under Biden expanded, but under Trump, it was just telling Europe, you've got to pay more. I mean, it was, okay, we'll keep doing this, but you guys have to pay for it. I mean, he's fundamentally a businessman. So he's kind of looking at everything from okay, let's make a deal. What's the deal here? Like, well, yeah, we don't really like this as America, mainly because it's a bad deal for us. And that's what he frames that for China and the trade, the trade war that he implements with China. It's all about, hey, we don't have an equal trade here, so we gotta level this out, and this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to punish you with, tariffs or something until we level this out. And that's so Europe, I think, is in for it when it comes to footing the bill for NATO and for Ukraine paying for this war. The question is, do you think Europeans? Well, right now, let's go back to. Let me just ask you some questions about what you've just said. First of all, how does the United States wield this kind of control over Europe? Like, what is the weapon? Where's this power stemming from, do you think? I mean, I don't think the United States is threatening dropping a nuke or anything like follow us or else you're going to die, right? What do you think? How is the US wielding this much power over Europe? Thank you so much for watching. This was just a clip from the longer, larger show that you can catch Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. That'll route you to the platform where you need to be in order to get the full uncensored show every Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Click on that link, watch the full interview. See you there.